Yes, a very good evening, everyone. I'm very happy that you all fit in some kinds. I'm very happy to see a full house here for this program, Russia and the EU in the Sahel, a race for influence. I'm Zara Toxis, and I will be moderating this event. And the Sahel region is facing turbulent times. 11 coup attempts in 4 years, a rise in jihadist movements, and Putin bolstering his presence. The military coups in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger have brought an end to the long-standing influence of former colonizer friends in the region. And Europe feels it's losing a key region for controlling migration and combating jihadism. And tonight, together with journalists and experts, we will, and also people on the ground, we will take a closer look at the safety challenges for both the Sahel and Europe. And this is a topic which is not often discussed. And it's good to know that the Sahel is quite a huge stretch of the middle belt of Africa. It's like very much of a desert. Live different communities, farmer communities, various languages are spoken, pastoral communities. It covers Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Chad, Sudan, and parts of Guinea and Senegal. But covering this whole region tonight will be impossible, so we decided to mostly focus on the Western Sahel, and still it will be a challenge to do justice to all the complexities there. And we have organized this event in collaboration with JASON, Institute for Peace and Security Studies. And before we start off, I'm heading to Leon Brown, part of the activities committee of JASON. Why did you feel the urge to organize this event?
Well, first of all, thanks a lot, also for everyone that is here. To explain that, I maybe briefly outline the JASON Institute now for 50 years organizes events about international affairs with a focus on security issues. And we felt that, as it was already mentioned, the Sahel zone is of vital importance, but is not very present in the public debate and in the media. If I have to summarize it in 5 keywords, we see a great power competition, we see migration, we see terrorism, we see a fight for natural resources, and we see a humanitarian crisis. And this all comes together in this region. And actually, when we talk about a failed European strategy in that region, we have to know that it's this week that France pulls out its very last troops out of Chad that have been stationed there since the 60s. Why is that important? It's important because, for example, in 2013, within a few hours, French troops were able to stop terrorist troops advancing in Mali. Things like that won't be possible anymore with Europe losing military presence there, plus China and Russia stepping in. So I'm curious to hear what the experts have to say. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Leon. Let me introduce our speakers. Very happy that you're here. Daaf Bodden, I'll switch. Daaf Bodden is a writer and a correspondent who since 2017 has traveled all corners of Africa to cover topics ranging from coup d'etat, protest movements, climate change and migration. Bram Vermeulen is a journalist, documentary maker and author, and since 2001 he has worked as a correspondent for the Dutch daily NRC Handelsblad in South Africa, and he has multiple series for the VPRO that cover the African continent. And here on my right, Ozan Albash is emergency manager for Doctors Without Borders in Sudan. He's responsible for emergency humanitarian operation in a country at war, and he previously worked as the head of mission in Yemen, Ethiopia, and South Sudan. Please give them all a warm welcome. So let's start with the situation on the ground. We both already mentioned that the region is a source of instability. Bram, can we pinpoint something as the source of this instability?
Well, let's start at the source. That if you look at this map, you see that the borders of all these countries are drawn on a table like we're sitting at in 1885. These are not countries. These are political decisions made by colonial powers for over almost 1.5 centuries ago. And so we see that the issues that are playing there have not gone over that century. Actually, they're right there. So you have, in a country like Mali, Bamako is lying more than 1,500 kilometers away from Timbuktu, where the jihadists were pulling into. Same thing in Niger. Niamey is lying thousands of kilometers away from the area where people are traveling through for centuries on camels to go from west to east. And so, I mean, the topic of tonight is EU's influence in this region, but I don't think that the region has had any positive experience in that sense with what EU countries were doing. And the most visual examples of that were from 2016. The only interest that the EU had for this region was to stop things, to stop people from moving. I went a lot to Niger. Niger is a transit country, that always lived, doesn't have much. It's a lot of sand, it's extremely poor, but it had transport. And it was exactly that sector that the EU, the Netherlands included, came to kill.
Control.
Yeah. So we cannot be surprised that there's a moment where people have had enough. And I was thinking on my way here, how am I going to explain what's going on there? But just explain it by a phenomenon like Brexit. It's populism. There's a feeling of discontent, and it's very easy to use that to start a mechanism. And we've ended up where we are now. So there are a lot of reasons we're going to discuss why it's maybe not working, but the same sentiments, you can find it here in Europe and you find it over there.
And we have seen in the past 5 years different military coup attempts in Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso. Daf, you have been in touch with people in Mali. How have their life changed under these military regimes? Can you elaborate a bit on this?
They are changing quite a lot recently. I was there in 2009. Then the UN was still active there. Dutch troops were deployed. French troops were deployed. But then the anti-France and anti-Western sentiment was quite strong already. Dutch troops weren't allowed to wear their Dutch flags on their uniform because it was a bit too close to the French troops. And then the second time I came in back in 2021, and the second coup in a year just happened. And then it was quite euphoric, the atmosphere back then, also among young people, because the anti-Western and especially anti-French position was quite strong. And like Bram said, it's voting not necessarily for the junta, but it's voting against the status quo with the Western and French influence. But nowadays, indeed, I was asked by you if I knew friends or colleagues in Mali who might be able or willing to have a say this evening. But it was surprisingly difficult, I noticed, because many said, frankly, it's quite dangerous for us right now to speak about France, to speak about Russia, or criticize the junta. They said, people are put in jail for less. So, things are getting more tense and more repressive, from what I know, at least from Mali. Yeah.
And can you say something on how, if you look at Mali, how the people look at this transitional regime under this military leader, Goïta? Because, for example, he promised elections, I think, a couple of times. How do they view this?
Well, like I said, at first they were quite happy, I think, because they were all quite anti-French. But I'm noticing now that it's slightly shifting, because the military junta, they said, of course, we will, what France and the UN didn't do, organize security, especially in the north and central region of Mali. We will pick that up, and in assistance with Wagner, now Africa Corps, we will secure the region. But it's not happening. It's even getting more volatile, more tense, and worse. So I think young people are getting a bit more worried by now. Yeah.
And Ozan, what does Doctors Without Borders do in the Sahel region?
Try to navigate in this difficult environment.
Dynamic, yes.
There are a few points mentioned that are actually quite critical. The reformation of power in this region now with the coup attempts or successful military coups and junta, with the anti-Western, anti-French notion as well. We do see a lot of similar trends between Burkina Faso, Mali, Chad, Niger, where the power is centralized with heavily militarized political elite in rather urban centers, capital cities, and main axis, and the rest of the country is marginalized. Of course, there's link with the jihadist groups, with the locally born groups. It's not always necessarily globally connected extremist Islamism, but also locally born jihadist groups. They are quite active in the rural areas, and what we see as Doctors Without Borders is the public services, which are, let's say, which were already struggling back in all this history, are even getting worse. The access to healthcare for the populations in rural areas outside big cities is almost non-existent. Insecurity is prevalent, causing either direct impact on people's lives or causing other challenges for them to benefit education, healthcare, or anything else that they can improve their well-being. And we see those trends very, let's say, explicitly in those countries in Sahel, including Chad, and the transition is prolonged eternally. The transition that you also referred, I think in Burkina Faso it was initially for 2 years. In Mali maybe similar. Now it's more than 5 years. In Sudan we have seen this in the past as well. After the ousting Omar al-Bashir, the transitional council did never actually transit into democracy, and eventually where we ended up is a civil war with more than 11 people being displaced.
And how did these coups in Mali, Burkina Faso and Niger affected your work?
Well, I think we can start with the shrinking space and the restrictions. So with those powers, or the new reformation of those powers, let's say, we are locked up in urban centers. So that's the first point to start. We are not able to move to the areas where actually people have...
These are restrictions from the military leadership? These
are restrictions from the centralized power holders, from the juntas. If we miraculously manage to get let's say, permission to go to the area where we have maybe an alert of an outbreak or alert for malnutrition, where the food scarcity is prevalent, the moment we leave the big towns, then we face the new layer of challenges, the insecurity directly threatening our staff members, our hospitals. You might have heard about it, but in Burkina Faso we had series of incidents that directly targeted our staff members or patients or the facilities where we work, which resulted Doctors Without Borders suspension of activities in the country. And I think that's a good illustration of what we are facing in those countries today. With the anti-Western, anti-French sentiment, it's also not helping, as we are an organization that has its roots in Europe, or the identity more European scene, at least it's perceived. We do come across the questions quite often if we have a French national in the car, if we have a European national in the movement, which brings us down to a very difficult decision of profiling our team members going to those countries. Right now in 2025, it's almost impossible to deploy, let's say, Western-looking or anybody who are not from that region, from Sahel, to work in those countries, which limits our ability to have a diverse team, to bring different expertise, and to timely intervene on those humanitarian crises.
And we mentioned Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso a couple of times. They're often mentioned in one breath. Dav, can we compare these countries?
In some way, yes, but in other ways, of course, no. I think Africa in general is generalized too often, and it's a bit difficult for me to say because I haven't been in Niger or in Burkina Faso. I've been in Mali. you can maybe compare them right now in their position towards the West and on the geopolitical stage.
They are together in this so-called Sahel alliance.
Exactly, and there are some differences. I think Bram can add to that. Burkina Faso, if I'm right, and Mali, they both staged the coup, saying that they would take measures to improve security. But if I'm right, in Niger, the security issue was a bit less, right?
Yeah, a lot less. But the elements are the same. I actually see it as a mafia takeover. So basically, if we look at Niger, the man that's now in power, Tiani, was basically the bodyguard of the sitting president. So it's not as if the old elite has gone. It's the same elite. It's just a different guy who wants again to make money like his predecessor Bazoum did, who got a lot of money from the European Union, for example, for migration deals. Now, at one stage, that money is finished, so you have to do something else. So you call somebody else, which is exactly what he did. So French are out, Russians come in. There's a lot of money to be made. There's uranium. In Mali, I was just looking at that. There's a big mining company. Mali has one of the largest gold deposits in the world. And so there's an international mining company, Barracks, formerly ran gold, which is headed by a South African CEO who was almost taken hostage by the junta to pay more than 300 million in taxes. They caught 4 of his guys. He's out. He's somewhere internationally in a nice hotel. The bill has now been raised to $1 billion in taxes that they have to pay if they want to keep mining in Mali, which they do. So this is about money. This is about the same guys who were living in the same palace. They just have a different name. I don't know if we can show, because I had an interview with one of the guys.
Yes, and I forgot to say, right now in the background you see the beautiful pictures you took. Hold on, and indeed we have a fragment of you in conversation with a military leader in Niger.
So basically a group of people who took the power, and we went to Niger, I think the end of 2023, when it just had happened, and they were still a little bit more relaxed than what Dav is saying. So there were still people on the streets, people were still celebrating the fact that the French had left, just on a wave of populism. It's easy to sell that message. We are chasing out the French because we are looking after you. So the mayor of Niamey, the capital, agreed to an interview, and for me it was the first time I got to ask, how do you commit a coup d'etat?
Let's have a look at the fragment.
C'est la première fois, je pense, que je rencontre un putschiste.
Non, pas un putschiste, un patriote.
Un patriote?
Oui.
Pas putschiste?
Pas putschiste.
Pourquoi pas?
C'est un patriote.
D'accord. Quelle est la différence?
La différence, c'est que le patriote, il mène ses actions en fonction des intérêts de son pays, pour la dignité de son pays, pour la souveraineté et pour l'indépendance totale.
Voilà.
Ça, c'est le patriote.
Et comment ça se passe, une coup d'État?
C'est des choses régulières, ce n'est rien de particulier.
Ah oui?
Non, pas du tout.
Ouais.
Comme les autres.
Non, mais c'est pas un jour normal, hein?
Non, c'est un jour normal. La preuve, ça s'est passé sans un seul coup de feu. Ça veut dire que c'est une action civilisée.
Mais pourquoi c'était nécessaire pour le Niger de faire un coup d'État en ce moment?
Vous savez, dans un pays, l'institution la plus hiérarchisée sur laquelle repose un pays lorsque rien ne va, c'est l'armée. Donc, lorsqu'il est nécessaire de remettre de l'ordre, l'armée remet de l'ordre. C'est la seule réponse que je peux vous.
must be very recognizable for somebody related to Turkey, where the military always took power when things were a bit chaotic. So that was the excuse. But if you look at Niger now, they left. Well, first they got a lot of criticism from their EU, the ECOWAS, so the cooperation of countries that don't allow people to take power like this. So they got sanctioned. They didn't have electricity when we were arriving there. People were living by generators, so only the rich people basically had electricity, which explains a lot of the problems you are having. So economically, Niger is doing much worse than it did actually before the coup. So no order was restored. It's just that a group of people was restored in power.
And he also says, like, I'm a patriot, the army comes first.
Yeah.
We also heard, or I also read, actually in the beginning also, like you said, that under the population, actually, the sentiment was, okay, great, some change. And how do they view this, like the army comes first? How do they view this state?
I mean, this was very smartly done. I mean, the French are very unpopular. I mean, this changed over time. I mean, like you said, the French helped out Mali when it was also after coup d'etat, when the jihadists and Tuaregs were taking over the north of the country. In Niger, the situation wasn't so much anti-French. I noticed when I was going there 2015, 2016, 2018, people weren't that vocal against French, but they were kind of infected by the Mali virus, basically, because in Mali, the fact that the French, the old colonizer, came to Mali to rescue Mali, gave the jihadists a very nice slogan, because they said, the Crusaders have come back, your old colonizers have come back. And so you saw that after the French came, Mali became much more insecure, so the amount of attacks came further towards the capital, further south, by every month. So it was very visible for everyone to see that the French weren't succeeding. Now they have a new guy on the block. The Russians have come. The mercenaries have come in. They have methods where, I mean, in the first month they came, they killed 500 civilians in one village. So it's not as if the situation is any better. It's just different. And now they see what different looks like.
Yeah, you already mentioned Russia. Also in the title, Daf, why are these countries turning to Russia?
Well, like I said earlier, first, I don't see that they are very pro-Russian. I do see that they are very against the West, so it's also a bit of a vote against the West, maybe. Secondly, those Russian mercenaries don't ask difficult questions like we do. We don't. What we are doing, for instance, in Mali is trying to create some sort of a liberal democracy, which will never work in a country like Mali.
No strings attached with the Russians.
Less strings attached, but indeed, like what Bram says, the Russian mercenaries, they don't bother about collateral damage or human rights and so on. Yeah, and the difficulty of as well is, I mean, I think in all the three countries there's a military junta running the show. I mean, for instance, Traoré, the captain in Burkina Faso, he was 35. I'm 35 now. He was 35. He was running a coup. I mean, I'm still figuring out life. But it also, these young men, they believe that the security vacuum is solved with military force. And they lack thinking of, well, the humanitarian needs or the legislative needs or the economic needs. So that makes it more volatile as well.
And if you talk about Russia, you of course talk about the Wagner group, also the paramilitary group in Russia. How is the population looking at them? Because I hear different voices of they're opening borders, which makes people happy, but at the same time they're also joining anti-terror campaigns and killing civilians. How do you see this?
Look, I think that what I've heard the most is it feels better. I mean, go have a look at the movie the soundtrack to a coup d'etat. You will see why it feels better. I mean, it's a beautiful documentary of 2.5 hours. It kind of shows that from the decolonization campaign from the 50s onwards, it was the Russians in Congo. In this case, in Congo, it was the Russians that were backing the liberation struggle. It was Washington that was against it. So it's very easy. I'm not saying it's very easy for regimes to refer to that period, like for South Africa, for Congo, for a lot of countries, it is just like that. And I went to the Central African Republic, which is not in the Sahel, but I met up with a president whose bodyguards are Wagner, or Russian mercenaries. And I was asking him about, but why, the Ukraine war had just started, and he was really looking at, why are you so interested in this? I mean, for me, it doesn't matter who helps me. The West is not helping me, so if Russia gives me a helping hand, why would I say no? Why is it so interesting for you? So we must be careful not to get confused by our situation, where we are looking at Russia as, of course, the invader of Ukraine. What does that mean for somebody in Mali or in Niger? It doesn't feel the same.
Ozan, how do you see this?
Well, I agree. I guess we are still looking at the issue from a very Eurocentric perspective when we talk about Russia in Mali. It definitely has a different meaning for the people and for the political elite. For the political elite, the economic interest and the power game is definitely in the center, as we have seen in the post-coup period, how much the needs of the population is disregarded, or the transitional justice or the transitional process is disregarded. It proves in the center of that period the interest and the power and the money was rather placed. Otherwise, the notions that came out of those moments, let's say, some had popular support, some maybe less, but Africanizing constitution, localizing resources, owning our own fate, like those sentiments are by themselves are not dangerous or wrong, and they did have support, we can tell, among the people. But I think maybe one thing to note here: those countries, like many other countries, like countries in Europe or other places, they're not unified one monobloc. They are actually, as you were saying, they're artificially created countries with so many different tribal dynamics, so many different interest groups, so many different people suffered through different reasons in the past. When we look at the EU policies in that region, the only and one interest EU had for a very long time in the last 2 decades was, well, particularly the last 1 decade, was stopping migrants. Yeah. In order to stop migrants, the legislation, I think you are referring to the same thing. In 2016, there was this massive change in legislation that criminalized the entire smuggling networks. Now, smuggling network sounds very bad, but it's also a bunch of jobs for a bunch of people. They were taxi drivers, bus drivers, driving people from Niger to other countries or across the borders, and suddenly there was this big crackdown, completely funded and directed by EU to stop that. And funny enough, the first thing that junta was that they did was actually reversing that legislation. There was nothing else but that. They removed that legislation immediately because people eventually connected that. Okay, this is EU pressuring our weak governments to create that pressure on us and our. Imagine you're a taxi driver on the border of Niger. You don't care much about Russia or France or EU by itself. You care about the fact that you cannot run your taxi and make money for your family anymore. And that was the consequence of the EU policies in that region for a very long time. And so the reaction to that, in that vacuum of power, going towards China or Russia, who comes with money and less questions, I think it's quite fair to understand why.
And to make it a bit more complex, you already touched upon the jihadist groups. In, I think, 2022, 50% of the terrorism-related death in the Sahel region came from jihadism. What's their influence and how big is their support base if we also place them in this dynamic between the military leaders, the Wagner group, the different, of course, very different jihadist groups?
Well, not insignificant. I can't tell how big. It depends, I guess, also in the country and the place. But it's absolutely not insignificant. And it's very similar logic, right? So now
You said it's significant or not significant?
It's not insignificant,
okay,
so
not
it's quite significant.
Yes, okay.
It's
clear.
a large influence over the region, and more importantly, across the borders, because this is also a region where people are still living in a nomad style. That's a different way of living. There are no borders for a lot of those communities. There's massive mobility between.
This is also about choice of words. So if you call people smugglers or you call them taxi drivers,
Exactly.
do you call people terrorists or jihadists, or do you call them farmers with a gun?
Yeah.
You know, because that's what they are. I mean, it's not as if they come flying from the sky, parachuted into the Sahara Desert. It's people from the region. And depending on what you want, maybe you want to have a gold mine. You know, then you need guns to chase people out. You scare them off. You kill a couple of villages. I mean, it sounds horrible, but this is, you know, the economics of the gun.
But just to be clear, there are some movement related to bigger jihadist movement, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the
or-
jihadist problem in the Sahel started more or less with the fall of Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, who had a huge amount of guns. Then NATO bombed in. Then he was killed, and all those guns flooded naturally into West Africa. And very soon, the jihadists run over the north of Mali. So, I mean, some of those jihadists were actually coming from different countries, from Algeria, Libya, but a lot of them were Tuaregs.
A lot of them are from there, and this is, and I think the best way to interpret that increase of that insurgency is to see it as an outcome of another problem, rather than a source itself. Why is there such a big popular support to a lot of those groups? Is because when we look at those regions, these are massively underdeveloped places with discrimination, exclusion from their own power holders. Here, we're not talking about necessarily France or anyone external. So the reaction is towards the political elites who are still holding the power. Very rightfully said, they're just changing shirts or names, but it's still same political elite. And whoever excluded from that power access or economic abilities are upset. And one way to show that anger is the extremist Islamism. And
one of the reasons for this uprising was an entity called Azawad, which is the dream country of the Tuaregs in the region, who never bothered with the borders that were drawn by the European powers. They just, see themselves as one nation, spread over Mali, Niger, four different countries. So they made an alliance with Al-Qaeda and became a big part of the security problem. But they are from the region.
And we see also the jihadist movements competing with the Wagner group. How should we look at this dynamic also with the military regime hanging above this? Like, how should we look at this?
How we should look at the Wagner regime?
The Wagner groups, the dynamics between the Wagner groups and the jihadist movement.
Well, I mean, Wagner is not more successful than the French were. In fact, quite the opposite. I mean, the first time I heard about Wagner was when they popped up in northern Mozambique, completely different region, southern Africa, where they were facing also local uprising of jihadism or whatever you want to call it. And a couple of them got killed. They got so scared they ran. Wagner left very quickly. Then they popped up in, of course, Syria, Ukraine, also, and the Central African Republic. And there they were quite successful. And because the message spread, basically, for what they did in the Central African Republic and in Libya, they were also then hired in Mali. But we've seen that, I mean, there was a huge killing of Wagner mercenaries quite recently in northern Mali. They not necessarily. I mean,
because different groups got together, right,
to fight them. Yeah, and we mustn't overestimate the Russians. So basically, Wagner mercenaries is usually a group of 1,000 military, maybe 2,000 if they have the money. But after the war in Ukraine, they became very few, and not necessarily your best trained guys either. I mean, I saw them walking in the streets of Bangui in Central African Republic, quite podgy, and not all, not all of them very athletic, and so they make mistakes as well, and they get surrounded and they get killed. It's really, I mean, if you would compare it with the power of the French army, I would actually say that the military is worse off than what Wagner or the Africa Corps. Since the death of Prigozhin, they are called Africa Corps, so basically the Ministry of Defense from Russia. But it's a way for Putin and the Russians to show that they are a world power, because now we are talking about them. Now we're writing about them. Oh, Russia's not only in Ukraine; they're taking over half of Africa, so it works. So you need just 1,000 guys to do something like that.
And you see also the difference between the countries, how they deal with the Wagner Group. I think with Mali, it was like not really mentioned, a bit sketchy, but in Niger, it was like almost live streamed, like Wagner is setting foot on our ground.
Yeah.
Difficulty also with the jihadist movements right now is that with the Western military support, also the eyes in the sky left. So it's harder to track jihadist movements, which is Wagner or Africa Corps not capable of either. So that.
Well, that's another thing. So that's the element of the Americans. We haven't talked about them yet, because the Americans actually had the most soldiers in Africa. I mean, it's incredible if you look at the map how many military bases the Americans have all over the place. So if you went to Agadez, where is the capital for smugglers in Niger, and you saw left-hand side of the road, you saw a lot of smugglers. And then on the right-hand side, there was a huge office where these hamburger-eating, baseball cap-wearing guys were sitting the whole day behind their joysticks, flying over the Sahara. I don't know what they were doing. Nobody knew what they were doing. They just had claimed that whole part of town where they were gathering intelligence. I mean, incredible, isn't it? I mean, at one stage, a couple of American soldiers were killed in Niger, and the whole of U.S. and New York Times were like, "Huh? Do we have soldiers in Niger?" Yeah. Go have a look at the hotels there. It's massive. We
will also talk in the second panel about the security gap that is left with actually the withdrawal of the US forces. Ozan, if I understand correctly, because of different attacks, Doctors Without Borders had to leave Burkina Faso. What kind of gap did that leave behind?
I am afraid where we were was already a very small footprint before we left, because of already ongoing insecurity and other challenges. But of course, it leaves a gap of an independent agency who is able to mobilize resources timely to respond to the outbreaks, where the government or the public institutions do not have the capacity. So it leaves a gap behind where, in a massive, let's say, humanitarian crisis, a major player is out, and it's not just MSF, the Doctors Without Borders, but also what it represents, right? So United Nations agencies have been already struggling to operate in all those countries, and even worse today, as they're seen, perceived by the people or the political elites or armed groups as part of the Western Bloc. Many other humanitarian agencies, charity organizations, smaller groups or volunteer groups are not able to navigate in an environment like that. It requires a heavy security, safety management. It requires an engagement with those armed groups in different levels. An organization like Doctors Without Borders is maybe one of few organizations that has that capacity and risk appetite and ability to navigate. However, we are out. And Doctors Without Borders also brings, of course, a value of reporting and monitoring and observing and sharing with the rest of the world. And in many places that becomes a challenge, because in many of those places it's not desired by the ruling groups, parties, to have organizations like MSF that documents the atrocities, that documents the problems that people are going through and shares with the rest of the world. Before we had to suspend our activities in Burkina Faso. If you would look at the MSF archive, you can see a series of publications about the worsening malnutrition situation, worsening sexual reproductive health care situation, increasing sexual violence, caused by some of those actors, and the more we publicize those facts, the harder it becomes for us to work as well.
And before we go to our next speaker, we already started that, this topic isn't often discussed. So again, I mean, maybe we should do it more often, because I see a lot of people are interested. But why do you think that this topic is overlooked by Western media? Maybe, the last question to all of you. Start with you.
Racial bias.
Yeah.
Racial bias and the problems that are far from home. When the problems affected the home with migration, suddenly the interest increased as well. And we started seeing those countries named in media in Europe or in certain events. However, unfortunately, still with a racial bias, with a lot of connotations, with a lot of criminalized or different types of stigmatizing ways of describing, rather than giving the agency to people in those countries and understanding what they're going through. So, yeah.
Would you agree, Dav?
Yeah, and I mean, we look at the world, like you said earlier, from a very Eurocentric perspective. So when we look down south, we look at all the issues migration people are saying are bringing to Europe. So the focus is mainly on that and very narrow. Yeah, I think the focus should be turning more south. We often nowadays, we also had it with the first term of Trump, we were saying, people who are very pro-EU, we were saying like, okay, so now we have Putin in the east and we have this orange guy in the Oval Office. And from the south, all those migrants are coming. So the EU is important. And instead, I would like to say, like, that's not necessarily true. Let's look for south for opportunities. With mutual equality, of course, not as some sort of colonial power. Yeah, so I think we should change our approach to the Sahel and to Africa in general.
Bram, something to add?
Yeah, I was thinking of a visit. It was like a press tour to Mali when former Prime Minister Mark Rutte came to visit the Dutch troops in Mali. And I still remember he was standing in front of those soldiers there, and he said, "It's great you're here, because what we don't want is that the terrorists from here are coming to Europe." And I asked him, why are you saying this? I mean, about what terrorists from Mali are you? I mean, he was standing in a country that was dealing with hundreds, maybe thousands of dead civilians every month as a result of jihadism. And so the idea of the Dutch being there was to help the Malian people against this threat. Whether that's effective or not, you can argue about. But the Prime Minister, for the press moment that I was filming, came to say that he was there, the soldiers were there to prevent the terrorists from coming to Holland. It was mind-boggling. And
what was his reply?
I said, why do you keep on saying this? Because he said it 3 times. I was there with him 2 days. I'm just looking at somebody who was working for the Dutch embassy at that time. But he said it 3 different times. And, oh no, I mean, if you ask Mark Rutte why he's saying something, then he will just say it again. You know? But I mean, I think that really kind of is part of the problem, the way we talk about this region.
To be clear, like the most victims and deaths of terrorism in the world nowadays are falling in the Sahel region. Yeah.
Thank you, Ozan. Maybe we'll speak to you later at the Q&A from the audience. Give him a warm applause. And now we'll have a call with our next speaker, Celia Dalmeida, who is from Mali and is living in Bamako, and she will speak to us from her office in Bamako. Celia, welcome. Let me introduce you properly, because you're country director of Mali for the NIMD, the Netherlands Institute for Multi-Party Democracy. And in Mali, they promote democracy through various programs that enhance equality and political participation of women and youth. And Celia has more than 20 years of experience as a journalist. media expert and specialist in communications for development. And she's now in charge of the NIMD's activities in Mali. A very warm welcome for you, Celia. Do you agree with our last conversation? Would you agree with the analysis here on why, well, the Sahel, or maybe let's say, why is Mali overlooked in Western media?
Thank you for the thank you for the opportunity to join your conversation, and greetings from Bamako. If I agree, I won't say yes, I won't say no, because it's a matter of perception. And saying from the Western, it's normal to see the things that way, because there is on social networks, in newspapers, and from, as you said, I'm a journalist, from the colleagues, they went on the fields, and having conversation with people, they can have this perception and view on the things. But what I can talk about is what I'm living, what I'm working with, the situation I'm facing through my work, and things we are doing on the ground, on the fields. And I can say that, there is a lot of challenges. There is a lot of issues that our countries, I can talk about the Sahel, because Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso are in the same kind of situation. And I can say that, there is a lot of challenges, but there is also opportunities. Opportunities to do things, because as the previous intervenant said, there is a lot of expectation from the population. And I think this is something that's our countries and their partners can build on those expectations, because people, the populations, women, young people, are willing for the change. And it's very important to be part of this change, not just seeing the situation from far and saying it's bad or good, but to see the opportunity to do things differently. This is what I can say for them.
And if we talk about opportunities, and maybe also with regard to the organization where you work for, what kind of opportunities are there?
Yeah, thank you. The first thing is, as I said, the will of change. This will of change is for us an entry door for creating spaces for various stakeholders. We work a lot with young people, with women on the fields in urban and rural areas. We work also with the known as legitimacy, traditional legitimacies. We will work a lot with political parties, even in this context. And everyone you talk with will agree that there was a situation that was wrong. There is a need to change the governance, to change the way to answer the population needs. And as the previous intervenant said, there is a lot of gaps even in the urban, but especially in rural areas. People are in big needs of health, education, justice, and there is today this kind of window that can be used to build trust, to build political dialogue, to build, even if the context, I can say it again, is not easy, but I think hard things can bring very good results if we work together. And this is what we want to do, what we are trying to implement here in Mali as a non-partisan organization. We are not here to say this is good, this is bad, the junta or not junta, European Union, which is a big donor for our organization, and we are very grateful for that, because they are helping us to continue putting on the table and in the public space democratic values that everybody recognizes here, like the values that people need to to build a better future. I can stop here and wait for your questions.
Thank you. You mentioned dialogues, civil dialogue. So you also mean that in this context of all the things we discussed before, the jihadist movement, the military junta, the presence of the Russians, this dialogue is still possible at the moment about what people want, how they want to change their country. This is happening right now.
Yeah, it's happening. Of course, it's there is a shrinking of public spaces where people can freely talk. That I agree with it. There is the situation, but there is always a way to do things. So as they said before, a misperception of democracy, a misperception of political ways in the public space. There is for us an opportunity to bring back the good values, the virtuous way to do things, and show up that, yeah, see, this is how things must be done. And to the political actors, to the young people that want to be involved in the public life, in the political life, to women that want to be more involved in this life that they are feeling like they are just put away of. There is for us, NIMD, still an opportunity to create spaces that all those people can come and talk together, share their views, and share their will for the future. And I think this is already very important. We are also putting in place since 2021 what we call democracy schools, where from 4 years now we have almost 600 young people from Bamako and also inside the country, Sikasso and Mopti, that are put together. We have pro-junta, anti-junta, young people that are 3 months together, sharing their views, building trust. And for us, this is the way, one of the ways we can use to build this trust, put back the values on the table and help Malian people to see what is important and work on what is important. Not just talking about geostrategic issues, but their own life, their real life, and how they can address their own expectation, hope, and views of life.
Yeah, and I also hear you saying create their own democratic values, which might not be necessarily the same as, I don't know, how people view democracy in other places of the world, but create their own values.
No, I won't say create their own values, because the democratic values, I think, are universals. There is the same will of freedom. There is the same will of dignity. There is the same will of satisfaction of their basic needs in the Netherlands, in Mali, in Peru, or in Australia. It's the same thing everywhere in the world. So democracy values are the same everywhere in the world. But the democratic system that we built around the Western system, the Western way of life, that doesn't always match with our way of life, our realities. This is what today, and people are more and more talking about how to endogenize, I don't know if the word exists, the democratic values, and put the system that show their own values, that show their own way of life. And I think this is a reflection that we need to have, not only in Mali, but everywhere in the world, and to see how the system will be on the service of the humanity, of the humans, but not the human at the service of the system. This is what we are seeing, and this is the failure of the democratic system today we are seeing everywhere in the world.
Thank you. Is there a question for Celia from the speakers? Maybe Daf?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Do I have to look over there? Or
No,
no, it doesn't matter. I don't know if you see me, Celia, but thanks for calling in. Well, I agree. I mean, the Sahel region and everywhere in Africa, it's the population is very young. I think the median age is around 20. So indeed, young people, to generalize, are less cynical, more hopeful, see opportunities. And I think maybe at first they saw an opportunity in the coups. But they didn't set aboard like the democratic values, not maybe the democratic system, but not the democratic values. How do they see look at an opportunity to restore those democratic values in, well, a country like Mali?
Thank you for your question. I think there is, as we are hearing the narrative about new partnership, there is also the narrative of the rebuilding of the country, the rebuilding of the values that leads the country. And this is something people are very sensitive of. When you say that, yeah, there is a lot of corruption and we need to fight this corruption, people will agree with you. And this is the narrative today. And I think what we at NIMD are doing, and also other actors are doing, is to give to those young people, to those women that want to be involved in the monitoring of the governance, in the skills to do that, to help this narrative become reality. Okay, you said you want to fight against corruption. Let's do it together. Let's see how your budget is built. Let's see how you are spending the money you are taking from our taxes. What are you doing with it? And we are aware today of this budget. We are able to follow the dispenses and to see if you are putting the money where you said you. This is small things, but small things put together can bring the change. And if we continue, and as I said, we are very grateful for the European Union to help us to do that. If you continue to invest on these young people, on these women that want things to change, by strengthening them, by giving them skills, by giving them comprehension of how the world runs, but how they can also contribute. I think this is not in 1 year, but maybe in 5-10 years, we will see the gain of this, because there will be slowly a change of the paradigm of this bad governance, because we will have new people with new values, with good values, that will be in power, that will have influence, and that can bring something new in the game.
Thank you very much, Celia. Celia Dalmeda. Thank you.
Thank you.
And we have a new guest, Grace Ellis, to the table. You're a researcher at Klingendahl Institute and the policy advisor. You're specialized in conflict studies, focusing on West Africa and the Sahel. And as part of the conflict research unit, you contribute to the Sahel program, studying the political economy of conflict, access to justice, and the role of state and non-state actors. Good to have you here. How do you reflect on Celia's analysis, maybe also on thing of different democratic institutions, the power of the youth?
Yeah, well, she's maybe still listening and watching, I don't know, but big thanks actually, and thanks for inviting me to the table today. One of the things that really strikes me from what we've just heard is actually the potential and the optimism that is there for a region that we often catastrophize, and we often speak of violence, of hardship, of plight. And yet in the words there, we hear something of something better that exists in the present and something better that certainly will come in the future. And I think it's what we're tapping on today in terms of really trying to understand what has been, sort of what have we learned from the past. If we're talking about Europe and we're talking about military and development cooperation, we're talking about the past 15 years explicitly in today's conversation, although it predates this. And then it's like, well, where are we going from here? We talk about the youth bulge. There's the continent, West Africa, is going to change so much in the next 10, 15, 20 years. Can we be part of that narrative shift? Are we going to be a part which supports that, or are we going to be a part that holds it back or is resistant to that change? And it touches on so many of the things that we want to explore in this part of the discussion right now with the geopolitics of the age. But maybe it's quite nice to start from a more positive note. So that's thanks to Celia just there.
Yeah, and I don't want to neglect this optimism and positivism, but I also do want to go back a bit to the hardship, because Bram already pointed out in the first conversation the role of the US and their withdrawal. So if we look at these security dynamics, the US forces invested some $100 million in a drone base in Agadez, and of course in other military bases. So now that they left, what kind of gaps are there? Like, who is going to fill this void?
Yeah, I mean, not just US, right? We've seen the withdrawal of France. We've seen the withdrawal of EU training missions. We've seen the withdrawal of the UN peacekeeping mission.
Maybe especially the US because of their intelligence.
Because of the drone warfare. Well, we see middling powers that are able to provide drones to the juntas that are in place. So, we've spoken a lot about Russia. I guess we'll speak a little bit more about Russia, the EU. But there's also Turkey that's providing drones to the military governments right now. We see that Russia, actually, the past few weeks, we've seen that they've moved some of their military equipment from their Syrian bases into the Sahel. There are questions, actually, about the strength of some of the military units and the capacities in the Sahel if it's not able to sort of stop off in Syria along the way. So this could be quite telling. It's too soon to tell, but so far we've seen provision of military equipment very easily be filled in by other actors.
And if we look at, we also talked about the Russians don't impose anything, no strings attached, which might work on the short term. But if you look at the long term, can they live up to this?
I was so interested by the conversation that was happening beforehand, the earlier roundtable, and I wanted to just jump in and a little bit question what is Russia's role and what do they want their role to be here. And let's just be clear, you mentioned that they haven't done an astounding job so far at tackling the violent extremists, and perhaps that's because that's not really what they're there to do.
Exactly.
And perhaps we should see them as they're providing the service, they're getting paid for the service. They're there as regime supporters right now. They're backing up governments that are non-elected individuals that are looking for support to be able to justify their presence. And they're doing a pretty good role at making sure that those elites are kept safe.
And they're making money.
And they're making
They're making money. So all these activities are about mining. So they are about mining in Sudan. They are about mining in Mali. They are about tropical rainforest in the Central African Republic, and mining and taxes, and even in the money business they're not always successful, because in the Central African Republic the Russians were actually making so few money. Some of them started restaurants, started a vodka factory, and even that wasn't doing so well. But I mean, the main target there is, of course, making money, which doesn't make them that much different from Western actors, let's be honest. But we, of course, always have the NGOs and the good intentions on the side.
Would you agree that it doesn't make them really different than the Western forces and organizations?
I would disagree. I don't think it's clear cut as that, but that's a very easy answer.
The French needed Niger for the uranium, right?
Sure,
mostly.
I do believe that it's more like part of the issue that we face with many of the problems around the world today is that we see big problems as single issue conversations, and I think there's more.
What do you mean by that?
What I mean is that we can't see French interest in Niger as only for uranium, and I think it's a very easy narrative to go along with, and I think that it has easily been utilised to sort of fuel part of the anti-French sentiment that rose
Sure,
over
yeah,
the year.
because this argument is being used a lot in the streets of Niger. We want to have our own uranium. Now it's going to the Russians, but yeah, that was the argument in the street.
Yeah,
Which is populism.
So I think that even when you speak to policymakers themselves, there aren't always clear interests among their own departments that are able to be articulated because people bring in different interests to the game.
There you go. Yeah.
And I think you see also with turn of governments that new set of interests come in. So national interests are being redefined with every government. And so therefore, once again, seeing things as single issues don't really help us because actually what's at stake are the countries and the people living in those countries. There was a moment where we did speak a lot about the commitment to the international order, multilateral system. We would talk about the SDGs. There will be policymakers who genuinely sought to engage in the Sahel because they believed in peace and development cooperation. There will also have been people who were there for economic interests. So there's a melange, and let's be real to that.
And if you look then at the Russian involvement, do you see this melange also there? Do you think we should be more worried about their presence?
Worried at what sense do you mean there?
Well, if we're talking about their economic interests, I also heard of nuclear deals, uranium deals. Is this something we should worry about?
Well, I think a lot of the discussion around Russia has been on this inevitability of their rise in the Sahel. There's nothing inevitable about it. You know, there are moments in time where the trajectory can change, and I think there could be concern about their access to resources right now vis-a-vis how other actors feel that they've been pushed out. But maybe it's more productive on our side to look at more of those dimensions of what happened in the 2010s that enabled some of that narrative which fueled the anti-French sentiment. Also, the Europeans are not seen with the same kind of
And what happened
favor.
in the 2010s?
In terms of you had the fall of the So in 2012, you had the sort of secessionist movement in the northern part of Mali. We were talking earlier about how both African and French troops went in to intervene. Hollande was celebrated. He was completely celebrated when he walked through the streets of Timbuktu. And then you saw a decade of both security and development cooperation. Now, security, earlier on you referred to stopping. Basically, all they sought to do was stop things. And that was very much like security stopped the spread of the extremism, while at the same time work on some kind of measures of governance and democratic reform and institution building. Now, interests aside, any of those things take a very long time to sort of play out. And part of the frustration that built among many populations were that issues were being compounded, an economic crisis, which you can't solely put on EU presence, you can't solely put it on Russian presence, you can't solely put it on the pandemic. You know, many things came into play, and yet it becomes very easy to try and find a scapegoat in a very difficult situation to try and understand.
Yeah.
Would you agree?
What Russia pushed in the very start as well, with the military coups, scapegoating France and the West. And then I think also to tap in on if there are other concerns about Russian involvement more in the Sahel. It's also about geopolitics and soft power. Russia, the Kremlin, Putin, they want to show their people and the international community, look, with the war in Ukraine, the West can sanction us, but we are still in the midst of the world and we are doing great. I think even if you look at, if I remember well, when the UN General Assembly voted for certain measures when Russia just started the invasion of Ukraine, if you looked at the voting, especially from Africa as well, it was almost like 50-50 of people voting against or not voting at all. And then the Western countries, and then the Western countries voting for those rules in the General Assembly. So I think from a Eurocentric perspective, we maybe should be a bit concerned about who is getting isolated.
I mean, I just want to bring it back to actually the start of the conversation, where I'm really wondering, for example, when we're talking about multi-party democracy, looking from Bamako, that's a completely different story than looking at this from Timbuktu, which is like 2,000 kilometers away. So the start of the problem, and I want to talk about that, is these countries are so huge. I mean, let's look at the crisis in DRC Congo at the moment. You know, a neighboring country is much, Kigali is much closer, the capital of Rwanda, than Kinshasa is to Goma. So there they go. They take the land, just like Donald Trump wants to take Greenland. They take the resources. Sorry, I'm making things simple. But the issue is, of course, these countries have been drawn at a table, and they're too big to govern. They are too big to govern. Even Bamako is maybe too big to govern for this government in place. So how can you come out of these kind of crises where people with arms just walk into your part of the country, take whatever they want to take? I mean, shouldn't there be a new Berlin Conference? Shouldn't there be a new carving of states? I don't know. I mean, you study this subject, but
by European powers, you mean?
Not by European powers. No.
The Berlin Conference is about the states being divided.
I mean, the states, because it's in Dutch we say je probeert een vierkantje of een cirkel in een vierkantje te stoppen. Weet je? We were using the same.
I was going to translate.
Measure. We have parliament, we have courts, we all these Western, instruments of democracy. How is that going to work in such fragile states?
Yeah, I think what Celia told us earlier, making the difference between democratic values and a democratic system. I think we in Europe and in the West, we kind of have this idea like we put a liberal democracy as we have it over here. We put it in this IKEA closet kit, and we send it to countries like Balie. And we say, like, here you go, build this liberal democracy. They don't have the same tools as we have. And then they don't succeed.
And if it doesn't work, then we send military.
And Grace, you're also a policy advisor, talking with different governments. What do you advise them? On all these countries altogether? It's a very big question, but
definitely,
it relates.
Definitely not getting around a table and dividing up the continent again. I'll tell you that much.
Why not? I'm not talking about Europe. I mean, outside powers. But why wouldn't the region, have that discussion?
But that is a discussion that they should, could, and will be having, right? But I really believe that we do not need to be at that table, and we do not need to be presiding over that.
No,
we don't need to be
as Western actors.
No, the West shouldn't be at that table.
And I think those conversations are happening at multiple levels in terms of what does the future look like. And we know of violent extremist organizations that they surely don't know national boundaries, and also they are able to move according to where there's opportunity. And that's where this point about how we understand this space is so important, and also how we understand security responses to any act of insecurity, because without addressing deeper rooted issues, you simply push the problem somewhere else. So you securitize one area. These groups are versatile. We've seen it. I mean, there are some amazing visualizations. Sorry that the topic is very sad, but there are amazing visualizations that show the movement of these groups. And they simply move wherever there's some kind of vacuum. And then they simply exploit the ample fault lines that exist at the community level. You referred to people earlier as farmers with guns. At some level that exists, but at other levels it's more. It's so dependent on the circumstance And any future which is going to be one which is able to eradicate that kind of violence from everyday life is one that has to shift away from what we understand in our present day. It is moving already. What that's going to look like.
So let's look at the three countries we were talking about tonight: Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, who've now stepped out of ECOWAS. Today, yeah, which is gonna, give them first and a lot of economical problems. But it's also interesting to look at that because of, people in Western Niger feel very related to the people in Eastern Mali.
Yeah.
So could something like that come out of that, actually, or new entities or countries, or...
You mean a sort of economic powerhouse within the AES?
Yeah, or where borders between these countries actually would disappear.
But I mean, I think in many ways, ECOWAS, one of the successes is the freedom of movement and people.
Yeah.
And we see, so if we look at the issue that we have right now, it's how are these Central Sahelian states going to renegotiate their access to ensure that they're able to on both sides, that they'll be able to access each other's economies and access even just their social functions with their neighbours. The highly politicized response is one of the things that yet again creates such an issue. You see right now the border between Niger and Benin up at Malanville has been closed, and it completely destroys the ability of people who trade as part of their everyday to be able to get on with things. What does that do? Pushes them into the arms of the people who are trying to exploit those grievances. So it's today that the AES have officially left ECOWAS. We're not sure what comes next, but I think that if ECOWAS are really able to sort of encourage this concerted and coordinated response to security, to economic measures, then in a way you've got the two of them that have to the two of these bodies that have to negotiate how they're going to access that land, that territory, if we don't want to talk about countries, area of space and populations.
One of the paradoxes was that I went to Niger the moment the junta decided to abolish the anti-migration law. So everyone in Agadez was really happy, as you can see in the next clip. But there were no migrants because the borders were closed as a result of the sanctioning and the fights with ECOWAS. So there you also see this kind of nationalism also works against this whole idea, because the borders need to be crossed. They need to be open for trade, for people, for
Maybe we can have a look at the fragment where we see you on a truck in Agadez.
Yeah, so this is on the day that the law was abolished.
Het is een ongelooflijk beeld. En ook, ik kan me voorstellen, echt een nachtmerrie voor Brussel. Voor de Europese leiders die de afgelopen jaren alles bij elkaar 5 miljard euro in dit land hebben gestoken om een deal te maken en de autoriteiten te dwingen om alle migranten hier tegen te houden, zodat ze niet doorreizen naar Libië en daarna naar Europa. En dat geld is er ook opgegaan. Alles wat je nodig hebt eigenlijk om zo'n deal op te blazen is een staatsgreep. Dan is het gedaan.
Yeah. So
5 billion euros.
Yeah, but so you need a bit more because you need open borders to blow, So I think I'm not sure what the latest is. There is a little bit of migration taking place, but it's not like it used to be in.
Not that booming.
Not that booming business.
If you look at this fragment, do you think we have sufficiently learned from it?
From
as
this
Europe,
fragment
yes.
Here? I don't think that we as Europeans have fully reflected on how it is that we frame and talk about a continent that some of our governments colonized. We've not reflected on how we talk about that country. We see that in high-level speeches, talking about gardens and jungles, talking about requesting gratitude or expecting gratitude.
Macron. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. We require a rethink about how it is that we both ourselves think about this part of the world. I see it happening in certain programs and missions that are being sort of implemented in the region. So I see that, for example, with security mechanisms that are being put in place, there are more civilian-oriented components being woven into their design now, which shows that some of these documents that were written in the past 5 years or so are being taken on board. How that will play out is a different question. But fundamentally, I think we need to look at this building of goodwill and establishing mutual respect, working at multiple levels. We can see where we go.
I want to see if there's a question from the audience for these speakers, or it could also be a former speaker. And I come to you with the mic.
Oh, thank you. Thank you all very much. I was wondering, and I feel it's kind of hovering above the table, but I think the issue that we are facing today is that for us in the Netherlands, to be able to speak about this, we feel like we have to justify why we would put Dutch tax dollars into this problem. And that makes us give things a frame and a focus that is actually doing the absolute opposite of what we want to achieve in the region. And I was wondering if you at the table have ideas about how we can achieve that different, giving people in the Sahel the agency that they deserve and still have a narrative that helps us explain to the Dutch public why we're spending their money there.
What do you think, Grace?
I'm not the Dutch one at the table.
You don't have to be the Dutch one.
I heard you speak Dutch. It was pretty good earlier.
I would actually refer the question back to you, because what do you think? Because you've been
you have
working,
a specific idea yourself?
Well, you've been working in this with this question for a long time, so
you know each other. Are you the one from the
industry? Well, used to.
I'm not here in that capacity.
No, but I mean, what do you think?
I think it's complicated. I think in the political context that we are in right now, the political context needs us, this is my personal opinion, needs us to have solidarity and to take into consideration what is needed and to listen to others. But I think the political context in Europe is making it very difficult to sell that. So I'm asking you, because I'm struggling with this. I can tell the story about how important it is, and people will go, yeah, well, but you lived there. So, of course, you're going to think that's important. But why is it important to me? I never leave my country. Why should I be my mother, or my child cannot find a house? My mother needs care. Everything is... why am I spending my money on that?
Bram?
Well, I mean, look, the way that's been spoken about this region, I think, in the last... let's say 10 years especially, is always in the context of terrorism that we need to fight, migration that we need to fight. It's always a problem that we need to fight, and therefore we are spending money there. And it's never about how could it be in everyone's interest to actually, let's say, start developing something. I mean, I had a conversation with some mayor in an area in Senegal a couple of years ago. And that specific town that he was trying to govern was a town where a lot of young people left from Senegal to go on boats or across the desert to get to Europe. And we were talking about what do you do about this? And he had a lot of families he needed to visit because their sons never came back. And he said, well, first the Europeans came here and they needed us as either slaves. Then the First World War came, and then we became their soldiers. And then the Second World War, and we became their soldiers. And then you needed us for your car factories, the Citroën, the Peugeot, and we all came. And so these roots are well established by you. And now that we want to come by ourselves, you don't want us anymore. So if you don't want us anymore, build those factories here. You know, and we never have a discussion about this, how you can actually develop something that is, I mean, to a mutual interest for a politician in Europe and for a politician. And it's always one-sided because we got the big bucks. So yeah, it makes it very difficult in the situation, polarized situation we're now in Europe. I mean, America is just cutting all aid with Africa because it's all nonsense. So how are we ever going to come back from this in the next, I don't know, 25 years at least?
And it's going to be strange. I mean, Trump says he's a deal maker. He's power politics. I mean, the African continent, not only the Sahel, but Congo. It's much needed to keep that certain hegemony the US has. But they oversee it. I mean, the last term of Trump, he called, sorry for my words, African countries shithole countries. Mm-hmm. So, and I don't know, I'm also always looking for this like incentive or this idea, how can we take Europeans or Westerns along to stop seeing the African continent as a problem or helpless, and we need to solve their issues because they can't survive without or noble help. So in some way, and that's the problem as well, I think we should look from a European point of view also at the many opportunities we would have together. But only when you talk from a European perspective about the opportunities in the African countries. It sounds colonial or neo-colonial. So we really need to step away from that sense of superiority. I mean, Emmanuel Macron, the French president, he still has a bit that Napoleon vibe, to saying like, you should be grateful and thank France for the security.
How lucky are you to be living in French territory with
exactly.
no house, but it's
Grace,
French.
I'm curious because you also talk to some European governments we don't name right now, but are these then topics you discuss with them?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. But what I think is so interesting about your question is that it's tapping into a message that lands with people rather than what's happening within the sort of corridors of policymakers and these kind of big imposing buildings. And it's, in a way, it's different. The conversation, like how do I explain to my family what is going on today and what is going, and why Europe, why am I even interested in this region, and why am I even trying to make sense of what's going on? What's it to me? That conversation that I have with them is very different to how sort of channels of policy making have to function. And it's the difficult part because the technicality of this, you can go at it from the interest perspective, you can go at it from the value-driven perspective. There are different views and different perspectives in this, and within policy circles right now, it's trying to understand what's possible in the short term to be able to get somewhere that is sustainable and prosperous in the mid to long term, and that's really looking at this youth bulge, the economic opportunity, the respect, and the way of actually stepping into meaningful partnership with one another and forging something which is based on principles of equality between Europe and African leaders and countries. But that's not a message that sells to somebody on their Friday night TV. So they influence each other, but we've lost in this moment. What I see in this moment of political volatility in the European debate is that it's really hard to enter any form of conversation which is about values-driven. Mm-hmm. And it's really hard to get that hook in there to sort of really say that all of these kind of interconnected issues have some kind of direction if we let it. And if you believe in this, we can get somewhere with it together. But it's really difficult It's really hard.
Yeah, and we should be aware that, I mean, the narrative always creates this idea that the people, in this case in the Sahel, are very different from us, but they're not. In general, the human values are similar, and we tend to forget that because, well, the lack of nuance, the lack of balanced stories, perhaps.
I think we have a lot to rethink at the third round at the bar, because we're going to end here. I want to thank you all for listening. I want to thank all the speakers, Bram Vermeulen, Daaf, Borren, Grace Ellis, and also Ozan Albash, and of course Celia Dalmeida. Give them a warm round of applause and a very good evening.